another wonderful session and panel. I am currently joined with Professor Jabril Asset Tasfa Michael, and Professor has previously, he's an extremely humble person, just like to say the least. He's only allowing me to introduce only these parts of him, but he has such an extensive experience. He has worked as the previous as a minister of finance for Eritrea. He's also worked as a high-level officer planning of a commission of Ethiopia, and as an advisor for the International Monetary Fund, and also as a consultant for the World Bank, and finally, but not least, as an advisor to governments. Professor, welcome you on stage tonight. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much, Lojan, for that very gracious and kind introduction. I'm extremely happy to be here to join you in this conversation. Talking to the young, gives me great happiness. It's looking at the future and sort of being telegraphed, up front what's going to happen in the future. Maybe I might not be alive, but we'll know what's to say.
But just like it was your generation, just like to point out that specific point, it was your generation who led us to be, or allowed us to even like have a future. It was like under your command and under your careful plannings is like that we are able like to have like, for example, just a very direct conversation between you and me today, that if I were like, if someone was to tell me 20 years back that I would be sitting here just conversing with you, I wouldn't have believed them. So yes, thank you, you and everyone like to who has made this even possible for us young generation today.
Oh, thank you very much again.
So, Professor, I just like wanted to start off with like one of our first questions. It's like, as we previously introduced you as the former finance minister of Eritrea, you were responsible for overseeing Eritrea's national development plan. And what would you just say that were the most challenging aspects, and how did they affect Eritrea's foreign and international development aspirations specifically?
Well, that's a very interesting and very important question. What were the challenges? First of all, start with, I was not, responsible. It's a collegial affair, and everybody was responsible and accountable and engaged in this kind of venture in the transformation of the society. But the most important, challenge were, one is, of course, that issue of development. The other is the issue of democratization. And the third is the issue of nation building, not specifically for Eritrea alone. This is also the question of the day for all developing nations. The challenges were compounded for Eritrea in a sense because Eritrea was coming out of 30 years of protracted, most destructive war, because the feudal year. That was also coming out of 50 years of political struggle. So you can imagine the challenges were huge, but not insurmountable, because the people have, the Eritrean people have shown in their struggle, and when they fought for their liberation, when united, committed, and engaged for the sole purpose of gaining independence, but not only independence, liberation, that was what they were fighting for. So they had shown, they had proven, and they had tested themselves that they could do this. They were up to the task. So that was the most important aspect of it, the challenge. Well, Eritrea also, during the course of the struggle, had developed, assets to deal with this challenge on all aspects. And first and foremost was the strategic perspective of the Eritrean people. And that is everything, relies on the people. That it is the people who are the engines of history, the dynamo of history, those who, the actors. And if you have them as, mobilized, united, they can do whatever task they set to do. So that was one of the things. The other aspect was that the Eritrean people had learned to look back into themselves, and to look back into their history, to look back into their legacy, to look into their own economic, political, social, and and cultural assets, and harness them in order to deal with whatever problems or challenges were facing them. So that was a very important thing, and they were confident that they could use these assets again to deal with these problems, which were far lower than what they had to deal with in order to attain their own liberation. So that was one of the things. But as I was saying before, these challenges are not only Eritrea's challenge, but these are the current challenge of all developing nations. Particularly if you look into Africa, it's made up of so many ethnicities, so many languages. It's so diverse, and come brought together through external powers, and that melting pot process, that sort of coming together to work and feel and act and live as one nation, one people, is yet in the process. It's an ongoing process, and Eritrea is well advanced in this process. It's extremely advanced. It is fortunate because of its own leadership, because of its own sort of assets, and because of the commitment and engagement of its own people.
True, and I'll take you back on the point of that you mentioned about diversity. But I just want to go back to something that you mentioned and trying to link the challenges here and kind of like make a route that links between challenges and the way that you were able to thrive. Because I was reading that during your time as the finance minister, Eritrea had Africa's fastest growing economy, and and you mentioned the point about at that point where you were assigned as minister, Eritrea was going under so much liberation attempts coming from or emerging from a war. So how did you even uh, find a way? Of course, out of based on your expertise, how did you manage to shift the view from struggle and challenges all the way to giving Eritrea what was known as fastest growing economy, especially when it's if you think about it during liberation attempts and emerging from war, finance isn't really most people would what consider to be the most important aspect.
Well, first of all, I mean, there was no new thing. It's not the mobilization of the people, the engagement of the people, the bringing of the people power to deal with this challenge was only, it was not a new thing. It was a continuation of what was happening for the previous 50 years during the political struggle, during the armed struggle. So this, it was that one. Secondly, the struggle in Eritrea was not a very narrow, sort of directed at only liberation or raising, a flag. It was transformative. It's on its agenda were economic, political, social, and cultural transformation, modernization of Eritrea. It was for development. It was not, so it was not. It was simply the next phase, not the original phase or the sort of day one for transformation. It has been an ongoing process, and during the struggle, Eritrea had accumulated so much assets in terms of knowledge, expertise, in terms of mobilization, in terms of structures and institutions, and it's still ongoing, and that's the process. That's why Eritrea has been sort of resilient and continues to be resilient and continues to be sort of to meet the challenges of development in such an effective way, given even in a situation, in a position where there has been sort of tendencies and activities directed at isolating and the nation. It still continues to be resilient and to meet the challenges that it's facing, and that's because it draws on its own people, relies on its own people, whether inside or outside. And if we should not also remember that the diaspora played a great role, continues to play a great role in this respect.
Okay, and going on now from Eritrea more to the international stage, let's say, because you also have experience in so many multilateral forums and areas. So just wanted to touch a little bit upon that, because we're also trying to figure out a way of how Africa is or get a broader image of how Africa is currently being represented in multilateral forums. So, as someone who has worked with major multilateral agencies yourself, could you describe the current level of representation for African nations in these forums, and are there any specific challenges or barriers that prevent equal representation?
This takes me back. Your question kind of takes me back to a time about let me see now, February 28 years back, when Eritrea sort of articulated its position of engagement, rules of engagement with the international community. This was not a new thing. They simply articulating its position, which it had, on the basis of its own assessment of the global modalities of engagement, at the same time, sort of an understanding of what, how development happens, what's the role of external support and actors, as opposed to internal, sort of dynamics and internal resources and all that. And having assessed that, it had sort of articulated its own position. And that, is very important to relate to your audience, because I find it was what we might call defining moment for Eritrea's engagement with the international community on one hand, and on the other, it ended up being also an inflection point for the relationship between the developing world and the developed world. In other words, through multilateral organs, bilateral organs, or whatever, it became a defining. And the reason why it became so was that I remember it was the consultative group meeting on Eritrea that was held in Paris. And that is where, the UNDP, the World Bank, IMF, and major international, donors, bilateral donors come together and review, the government, talk with the government on, the programs and policies and strategy of development of the government, the need for assistance or external support, and the modalities of that support. And at that moment, the rules of the game were there, what was would be epitomized by the structural adjustment process, where it was that, the relationship was basically between donors and recipients, and the kind of power equation, the power balance was simply in a one-way channel, one-way flow, where solutions, assets and resources and knowledge and experts was supposed to flow in one direction from those who are developed to the recipient, and the recipients were supposed to be sort of supine, sort of subordinate, and where they have no action in their own sort of affairs. So that was the kind of what they call international alignment where Eritrea was faced for. And what Eritrea did was that, well, this is not going to be working for Eritrea. Because there is real serious contradiction between, sort of with respect to how views on development, how development can be achieved in terms of the sovereignty of the people, the right of the people. So therefore, what it did was it proposed a new kind of paradigm, a new kind of relationship. And what it called this was partnership, not the donor-recipient kind of relationship, but a partnership where, for the common good, those who have developed, who have the means in terms of knowledge or expertise or finance or material support, could support this to achieve a better good for humanity. Not in a sort of kind of to dominate that, but an understanding that really at the end of the day, development can only happen when the people are committed and set up to achieve development. It is their own, and more importantly, that development, the people have their own sovereign right to decide on their own destiny, shape their own destiny, to articulate their own vision, to own their own strategies, their own policies, their own programs. That is in a basic core sort of underlying what they call position, to say that really there's nothing about sovereignty if you don't own this, if you don't have this. And so that was it. So what it did was that really, forget the structural adjustment structures, forget that donor recipient relationship. Let's deal on the level of partnership, on the level of cooperation, because whatever, sort of the less developed countries manage to develop, they become better trading and, partners, better economic partners, better political partners, it creates a much better sort of, human community. And that was the position of the Eritrean government. What happened was at that moment, the arrangement, the rules of the game was simply that what I said, epitomized or encapsulated in the donor recipient kind of relationship through structural adjustment, where your policies are submitted to the IMF. It has to be vetted by the IMF, approved by the IMF. Otherwise, you won't get any assistance or anything. So at the end of the day, the Eritrean government decided that no, well, we are not going to be part of that arrangement. We trust our people, we are confident in our people, and we'll try to do whatever we need, but we will exercise full sovereignty. We will be self-reliant in this respect. Not that to say no to aid, not to say no to assistance, but simply say that aid is simply subsidiary. The most important thing is what the people can do for themselves. And on that basis, it simply left about $400 million of assistance and as on the table and say no. And what happened was that subsequent to that, relying on their own research in the government, was able to achieve one of the highest levels of growth during that interim period, before there was another war and which sort of derailed this development program to a certain extent.
And I want to also go back on this partnership. It's more like I like the way you put it as partnership, because it kind of gives the notion that it's a give and take process. It's it's delivered on equal basis to some extent, or fully delivers some kind of equity and there. So I just wanted to ask within this framework of partnership specifically. Because you also had this experience working not just for Eritrea but for other external governments as well, as an advisor, of course. Could you just tell us some of the challenges that as within that experience, that when engaging with these programs or governments or organizations, and they're supporting other countries within Africa, or if you're seeking aid from other so just to rephrase it kind of in a way, we've seen many countries, the trade kind of formation has changed over the years. It's previously it was mainly Africa engaging with or seeking donations from Western countries, and now after COVID specifically, we've seen a more a shift towards Asia, specifically saying China in that regard. So is there any barriers or challenges coming in within this treatmentship process that just hinders African nations from seeking profitable partnerships in this regard?
And yeah, I get your question. It's a very important one. The issue is, you see, I remember, colleagues from other finance ministers, development ministers, and when we engage with others, we were saying, Eritrea was articulating the same position, not only with respect to the, developed nation, but in terms of regionally, in terms of what, for cooperation, regional integration, regional cooperation, because this is, complementary. This is, what will enable, the people in Africa to sort of telescope the process of development, and accelerate development. And this, to do that, and relying mostly on their own resources and assets. And the issue that I remember hearing from colleagues was that how can you say, to say no to structural adjustment? How were you able to do this? And the issue was, it still remains the same. It is the ability to say no when the thing is detrimental to your own interests. To say that, no. The power of no is extremely important, particularly when it comes to Africa. Because Africa remains in this position, in this subordinate, in subservient kind of relationship, because it's been locked into this system, of global relationships. These things did not happen just now. This was a result of centuries of global integration, globalization that has come where it has put, Africa in a very, disadvantaged position. So to get out of that, what needs to happen is for Africans to really articulate their own position, affirm their own sovereignty, their own sort of that, to say to the world that Africa has the resources, the power, the energy, the ideas, and the capacity to develop on its own. It is not that it can develop; it will develop. It's not there is an assumption for the last so many decades post independence that everything, sort of the development models that have been thrown at Africa, the prescriptions that have in terms of policies and strategies that have been coming from outside, simply assuming that there's nothing, to contribute or to take on board from inside Africa, and that is has been a disaster because Africa is really has a history, has huge resources, intellectual resources, you know, institutions that have been serving Africa for millennia. You know, Africans didn't come to existence, during colonial times. They existed before. They managed their own affairs. They were able, there are, evidence of that, sort of testament to that in wonders of the world, in terms of historical assets or structures and everything. So what needs to be done is that to Africans to look inward into themselves, so really understand their resource, understand their history, understand the wealth of resources that they have inside of them, harness that, modernize that, and bring that into, sort of into being, into as a resource, as the means to change, transform. There's a lot, what needs to be transformed is huge in economic terms, social terms, cultural norms, everything. But that's only the task for Africans to decide. That's a sovereign right. Yes? The fundamental basic right is to be in charge of your own destiny. You don't want anybody to come to your household and tell you what to do, how to manage your affairs. That's it. Africa shouldn't do that. So, I've gone maybe too long on this, but the issue is this is the most important thing to do for Africa to assert itself, to affirm itself. Because of Eritrea's position that was taken about 30 years ago, people are now talking, even from Western, what you call high level officials, talking about African solutions to African problems, talking about country ownership, national ownership. All this is a result of what Israel did way back. This, it has basically been percolating throughout its beginning. And another thing that we must understand is the youth, particularly, are now aware of everything. They don't have the colonial mentality that, sort of the subordinates there. They are there. They are self-confident, It's the most useful continent at the same time. It's also the one that is really full of initiative, energy, sort of that. You can see that what's happening on the tech sphere. You can see that what's happening in the business sphere, You can see the commitment of the African youth, and this is, what really makes everybody else confident that Africa is going to really occupy its own space, in terms of international forum, and that is not at the invitation of somebody else or for him, not at the behest of somebody else or in the support of it, but because of its own will, because of its own strength. This is because it's confident enough to say, okay, this is how we look at them.
Yes, I totally agree with you. It's like because we're seeing so much examples, like for example, Rwanda right now, like making their path towards being this digital hub of Africa. Like there's so many initiatives, like not just Rwanda, like many African nations are like emerging and discovering like different ways of like just mobilizing the youth, and just like the youth are actually like the ones creating opportunities for themselves at this moment and stage. So that is like really nice to also highlight. And I just wanted to like mention about this specific. Now that we touched about upon youth, do you think the governments, now that youth are like more in the forefront of like creating their own opportunities, do you think um, governments are also looking at youth as a form of like manpower and like a useful resource, like to kind of like uh, push their countries forward? Because and this is like a very general question in itself, because like we have very like on either side of it we have like very different examples. So, and I might be biased asking this question, to be honest, is because I believe like my government in particular does not like listen to youth issues in particular, although like it's a very Africa in general is a very youthful continent. But yes, for these specific governments who like, because I'm coming back to the role that you took as advisor to governments. So in particular, like to these governments who are now like making the best of the best of use for their youth, what would you be like? For example, would you be advising them, or like would you specifically highlight in that regard?
Yeah. Well, here is the issue. To answer, directly to your question, in my thinking is that the youth don't need anybody's permission to be to be active. They have never been. That's in their nature. Youth are the agents of change. They are against outmoded thinking, outmoded kind of relationships, and against the status quo. That's that's it. Their role is to question things, and query things, interrogate everything, relationships, arrangements, systems. So that's one thing. They don't need any permission, and if the powers that be, the authorities, don't sort of respond or provide a positive environment that kind of brings the energy and use to, in a constructive manner, to transform the transformation process, the youth will take it on. They will do their thing. That's the most important thing. That's almost a law of nature. That's what happens. And the other aspect is that we must understand there has been this framework where it has depicted Africa as being, sort of reliant on aid and all that, But if you look at it, Africans are actually the most self-reliant people you can imagine, because most of them are small producers. Producers of materials or products, or providers of service. They are, go to any metropolitan center or go to the rural area. They are, farmers or peasants or, sort of herders, pastoralists, but minding their own, affair, businesses. These are business we must understand. They are not waiting for aid to be, by and large, the most independent, because they don't even work for others. In most instances, they are self-employed. So we must understand the dynamism that is in there. They are taking the initiative. Having said that, there is the important role of just for the state to play, because the state reflecting the sort of the communality of interests, the communality of common, and also resource that can bind resource, mobilize resource together, and that can also articulate the common vision. A common vision for the people to aspire to, setting goals, and at the same time bringing in resources that sort of that cannot be on the community level or individual level, but that cannot be done by the private sector, because the private sector is very fragile, very infant. Even at this stage, there are big enterprises. There are African billionaires. We know that, but by and large, the private sector needs support. There are areas that it cannot handle, it cannot task. Therefore, there's a need for a very robust, what you call it, role for the state. And that is where actually the Western prescriptions coming from the multilaterals has harmed Africa, because it has tried to sort of make that, the state intervention in everything. Agriculture is undeveloped in Africa because the state was prevented from doing that. It was not, it was a taboo for the state to go there, but it could not develop. Even, if you look at the developed countries, the role of the state in providing assistance, research, inputs and everything, creating the market for them, it's extraordinarily robust. So Africa should also rethink. What we must really talk about is that Africa needs to Africanize development. Its objectives, its goals, its strategies, its programmatic aspects, the policy. We should be able to do that. That's what, we should be able to really not copy somebody. Copying is all right, you can adapt things because it is a human experience. It's accumulated human knowledge. It's expertise. It's mobile. Not only mobile, it's migratory. Knowledge is migratory. It's been that way. People, civilization have copied and adopted from others. That's natural. That's the way knowledge develops everywhere. but we must be able to, Africa must be able to really articulate its own vision. It must, talking about global, how does Africa attain its own space? That's how it does it. Something that is in harmony, in consonance with the African fabric, economic, social, political fabric, with its own history, with its own, sort of experience, and with its own challenge, with its own challenge. Rather, in all respects, we can talk about African democracy. Its shape and modalities will be totally different from whatever is, in other areas, because there are unique features, unique background in every country. So therefore, we must talk about it, not only in political forms, but in terms of development. We must understand the fabric, the economic fabric of African societies, how the community is really relevant, how the I is much lower case than the we, in this case. So we must be able to understand that. If Africa is able to bring this forth, and it's been happening in areas. That's why there is this conflict, this friction happening. For example, if take my own background in Eritrea, that's what the Eritrean government is doing. It's simply, hey, this is where we stand. This is these are the solutions that we bring on these terms. It's not rejecting external inputs externally, no, but simply filtering that and assessing that, but also the main component being the domestic fabrics, the internal fabric.
And this is so interesting that you pointed out. And like, we also had a question presented by Mohammed from Senegal. He mentioned that how can people understand how resourceful Africa is, given the fact that change is frightening? And like, what about the youth who are blinded by politicians, which is like a case that it's not just in Africa, but it's in everywhere. We see like this politicians leading and politicians mobilizing youth, especially the young ones, because like they are in a sensitive age where they're just coming to form their ideologies. So how can we like reinforce change while refraining from it, portraying it as a frightening aspect when we're talking about displaying how resourceful Africa is?
Yeah. That's really an important question, because the real, damage that one of the real damages that colonialism has done to Africa is this divide and rule, this setting one ethnic group against another ethnic group, and that has not been washed out of the African political system. What we have is politicians still engaged in that. We have what you call, the sectarian politics is killing Africa. That's the whole thing, dividing, sort of the people instead of uniting them. And that is, who gains and loses from that is the vast majority of the people, the elite, sort of benefit. That's the whole thing, dividing people. And we must get rid of the sectarian politics. I said one of the main challenges that Eritrea faced was nation building. Nation building meaning that there are these, sort of so many ethnic groups, religious groups, regional regions coming together in one nation. Now, what we need to do is to engage in respect each other, tolerant each other, but understanding that at the end of the day, everybody belongs to the same nation. That respect, sort of creating the forum, the environment for everybody's culture to flourish, but beyond, at the same time, that there is much more, there is which binds together in terms of identity, sharing the same nation, the same vision, the same goals, having historical links and all that. And that's what we need to do. And I'm sure that, it's very important. And when it comes to the youth usually have their own leaders too. This is where the role of the intellectuals is, the role of the activists should be, is to really understand what are the problems facing Africa, understand in each nation, understanding that, and saying what is, the disastrous consequences of the sectarian politics that is, being nourished by the elite in Africa. Because You go to any city, go to Dakar, there are millions of people there, sharing the same faith, the same life, really, irrespective of ethnicity or whatever, or religious persuasion. But they are being divided by, sort of ethnic grounds. That's the currency of politics, African politics now. And that's what I think, one of the issues that you see in Eritrea is, for example, that nation building is very important, has been addressed, and the unity of the people, despite this whole external pressure, is a testament to how important it is and how successful it has been. So we must be able to do this. You look across the board now, huge nations are being torn apart by this ethnic, religious, all these conflicts. We should have no space, in Africa, because really, when you are talking about it, you're talking about the real serious questions about our, sort of economic development, social development, all this, not ethnic, sort of who gains to the seat on power. So it's a very important thing, and the problem is the youth should really be, I don't know, you cannot fortify them against this venomous kind of sectarian thing, but that's what requires courageous youth to come up and say no to this kind of sectarian politics in Africa.
And just like to touch up also like to just like deeply go into this topic, which is like to unify our common goals, amplify our voices on the unified aspirations we're having. Do you think, in terms of like representation, when we're talking about the African Union, for example, as opposed like to its counterpart, the European Union, or like if we're like comparing these two examples, in that regard specifically, do you think like Africa is having a unified stance or like a much representation as needing to like quote on you what you just said to Africanize development?
Yeah, it's a process. It's a real process. The journey has been a long one, a protracted one. When the African Union, as formerly the Organization for African Unity was, there were statesmen, visionary leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Nyerere and others, who were saying that really we should come together, Haile Selassie and Ethiopia, to come together, at a faster clip, really subordinating national interests, national, sort of space for the whole of it. That was way too, what do you call it, beyond what could be called realistic, because Africa has not even achieved national integration. If you are talking about regional, so we must first of all national integration, national unity, national, binding together. That's the problem, when we talk about sectarian politics. You're talking at the same level where people are being pitted, on each other's throats in one nation. And how can you talk about, regional, sort of African union, African unity, and African position, common position? Because this is, that's one of the deterring factors. But in essence, I think it's important to understand that they could go parallel. There are institutions coming on board now. For example, the African Free ACFTA, African Continental Free Trade area. That's coming into being. Sort of that will create a common market in a sense. Where allowing mobility across borders in terms of trade, materials, and capital, and all that. There's a start. It's going to be a long process, but I think what's important to understand this is that we must be able to address the national, nation building, national unity process, consolidate that. At the same time, we must be able to, address also these continental things. But much more importantly, we must be able to, Africa needs to secure the independence of the African Union. That the African Union does not even finance itself. That's a shame. You can't, he who pays the bucks, sort of choose the tune, so it's very important that Africa be able to really stand on its own, on its own grounds, because, to really be able to affirm your own self, your own identity, your own position, continental or national or community or individual. You must be able to be, at least to a degree, be self-reliant in that kind of thing, and to be able to suffer the consequences, negative or positive, when you say certain actions.
And now that we're like talked a little bit about like affirming Africa's stance as a regional continent, like regional wise. So let me just take a step back and like putting it on the individual point of perspective. So like if we have the example of like African representation in like forums like the United Nations Security Council, where it's like the UN body that is responsible for for mandating actions and making it a mandate instead of like giving recommendations, which is um, a very high level form. Let's say for example. So in that individual sense, do you think the African needs have been highlighted or Africanized by the Africans enough, or like what? In terms of individuality, how can governments and states reaffirm their stance in that particular form, let's say, for example?
Again, really a question that sheds much light on the Africa's position in the world. We must understand, all this global architecture of governance that we have was a result of a certain, sort of alignment of force or array of force about in the 40s, during the Second World War. And that reflected the position, the global position of power, the power balance between, it was basically, in essence, the multilateral organizations, particularly the IMF World Bank, were a creation of Anglo-American creation, so it reflects that. Whereas the United Nations had a broader sort of kind of Russian involvement and all that. But so that, that kind of structure, the architecture that we have, in terms of representation, in terms of decision making, in terms of mandate, all that is a result, a reflect, of environment that existed at that particular point. And it had worked, it has been in practice for the last 8 or so decades. This has created, on one hand, probably to a certain extent, it has reduced the, what do you call it? We haven't had yet nuclear war, probably because of this, sort of international governance system, possibly. It has created a higher degree of global integration, globalization, facilitated that in terms of free trade and all that. And so created a greater unity in terms of perspective, mindset, globally. Because if you talk about the youth, for example, the youth now, they have been influences from so many cultures and stuff, and they have contributed so many, others, that the two-way kind of relationship that now you have a really, the youth globally maybe are much more closer, share much more, things together than before. But having said that, the kind of power balance that's maintained is out of date. It's, the decision-making process is out of date. It does not reflect, it has no space for, if you look at it, for example, let's see, the 4 Western countries, you call them European, Russia, UK, France, and the United States have less than half of the population of India, and have, the seats as veto power in the Security Council. India does not even have permanent seat. It is, it doesn't have that. So that kind of situation. Africa, 1.4 billion, which is, the same, has no seat in the Security Council. If you look at it, the decision-making mechanisms and processes and voting rights in the other multilateral organizations, so say like the IMF and the World Bank, it's the same thing. Certain nations have veto power on this. So the most important thing is, in terms of representation, you can talk, for example, there have been 2 African Secretary Generals of the United Nations. You have the current head of the Director General of the WTO is Ngozi, who's an African. You have a Deputy Managing Director at the IMF and other similar posts within the World Bank and at IFC. But it's not the sort of having the figureheads there, those nominal heads there. It's the power structure. It is the balance. It's the decision-making mandates and processes that are there. And in those terms, Africa doesn't have any representation. Even when you talk about the staffing of these institutions, in most instances, Africa is well underrepresented on one hand. Secondly, it's not even the manning levels or the staffing levels or the number. But most important is the mindset, is the sort of the perspective of these people. It's predominantly oriented from a certain quarter of the globe. It's not reflective of African values, African systems, African principles, and aspirations. So in that regard, you must say this is, the governance structure needs to be updated. It needs to be changed.
True, I do agree with you on that. But before I leave you, there's like two questions that I just want to finally touch upon before we start answering the question that's on the chat. First of all, being, of course, you are fully aware, like over the last decades, we have this kind of like notion, that undeclared notion of like Africa as a country, like, or regarded as a country. How do you like personally see this? Because like there's so many ways to look at it. Like, yes, there are a lot of similarities when it comes to like talking about African nations, but yet there is so much diversity that is just disregarded when we bring up this notion. How do you personally see that?
Well, first of all, my view on this, my personal view is that this is an endowment that you have so many, sorts of diversity. It's rich in diversity in terms of cultural, social norms, in terms of everything in all respects. To have that kind of it's extremely rich. You have Nigeria more than 500 languages, for example, about 100 or so plus ethnic groups. In DRC, the same kind of thing. Everywhere. That's something that needs to be celebrated. That needs to be. But at the same time, we must understand that nations are unique in their own background, historical background, in terms of their formation, in terms of their composition, in terms of their, physical climate conditions to, sort of their economic sort of norms in, livelihoods that they have been pursuing, and their natural endowments. There are, so this is it. I think we should be able to differentiate that, understand that. There is this diversity, but at the same time, if you drill deep, what do you find in terms of goals and aspirations? Not only among Africans, but globally, what is people aspire to the same things: a good life, described in their own way. It's safety, security, peace, better economic opportunities, equity, justice. These are the same things, irrespective of who they are. So there is, we must understand this. So there is, at the same time, the unity. So, but in terms of putting something on the table, there has been this tendency before to describe Africa as an undifferentiated, helpless mass of people, that has been sort of the white man's burden, to call it the, to give rationale to their civilizing mission and all that. And they have, created that this mass sort of and that. So on one hand, you have to fight against that. Fight that. And you fight by that by disregarding that, disrespecting that, affirming your own being on the one hand. So that's on that, because that needs to be fought against, because it's racist on one hand. On the other hand, you must understand there are unique challenges, unique solutions, unique attributes of each nation. And, we must take that also on board.
So linking this before I leave you with the final question, I just want to like answer the question on the chat. So Mohammed also raised the question saying that is organizing model African Union. So for example, like what we're doing here is like we're doing the model United Nations, where like we're replicating UN committees in formal sessions. So there's also it has been going on for a while where like we are there's also like instances where like there is model European Union as well. And recently, like in I think the past decade or so, there has been like other universities organizing model African Union. So Muhammad was just like asking if this would be like a helpful platform to like kind of like raise awareness, to like kind of broaden the uh, walk or path towards unifying Africans.
Yeah, this any platform that is enables the sharing of ideas, the interrogation of concepts, of querying of established sort of modalities and engagements is very helpful. That's how you learn. That's how you move on, and that's how you highlight what the problems are. And we understand what needs to be done. So this is extremely helpful. I'm glad we are doing this forum. We are conducting this forum, and it's a way of also bringing people together. Sort of binding together, and so therefore this will create, hopefully, advance into people in changing mindsets. Having a broader this kind of interaction broadens the scope that you have. So this is extremely important to have that. But it's also, but it would require from all those participants, though, on one hand, to really try to understand who they are representing. To really, to drill deep and really look at the source, at the origin, not at the, what do you call it, the image that has been externally created. This has to be, not as a narrative that has been, externally imposed. It's better, to really look back into whatever, if they are representing the whole of Africa, look into the whole of Africa. If it's sort of one nation, then look into that, what it is, what's happening there, but going directly to the source, not filtered through external sources. That would be the most important thing to do.
And I think that should also like be one of your that should also give an answer to my next question. It's that in terms like we're looking now at the future. So in terms of the future, like just like kind of like summarizing all of this conversation, what change do you hope to see in coming decades, or is your aspiration for the African youth, for the youth in general around the world, and especially when it comes to like especially when it comes to like the African representation?
The future is already in the present. We're looking at it. Look how, what's changing in Africa, the dynamic, things that are coming in terms of innovation, in terms of initiative, in terms of, original thinking and everything that's coming out of Africa. Look at it. In terms of whole society moving forward, really asserting themselves, affirming their own values. Look at that. And if you take that, look at the what's happening even in the area of culture, not fashion, for example. Look at see how everywhere Africans are developing their own national fashion, creating, representing all the diverse attributes that they have, assets that they have in terms of cultural, depending on the ethnicity and all that. They are this is going on. It's just, it's here. The future is here. It's happening. And you look at regional institutions, they are become more and more independent, more robust, and more reflective and representative of Africa itself, not rather than being sort of conduits or being sort of instruments of external powers. They are that. People on the political sphere, people are now demanding that, they are speaking their minds. They are affirming Africanness. As I said before, development is being Africanized now in all respects. Development is full spectrum. It's not only one line. It's talking about, when you talk about development, it's talking about politics. You're talking culture, social structures and everything. Technology, the material things of life. Production, everything, and that is really moving on forward now. Africa is in a lot of ways leapfrogging, and that's what the future of Africa is going to be. Now, how will it percolate upwards and have sort of where the political representation and where Africans would be able to assert, say, for example, instead of being invited to this what do you call it, wherever one external nation is flocking there, whether they are going to say, okay, Africa is organizing this meeting to talk about its engagement with the rest of the world, and we are inviting China, Russia, whatever, America, Europe, to come here, on our soil, and we have, fruitful, productive engagement. Right? That's what I mean. Being in charge of its own business, being in charge of its own process, being in charge of its own, what do you call, continental life. That's what's important, and I think it's happening. It's gradually happening. This is now there is a consensus developing. That Africa needs to really recognize, celebrate its history, recognize its own cultural assets, social structures. In Africa, the community is very important. For example. That has been used even in the times of the what do you call it, COVID now. That has been harnessed, to deal with, to take care of each other. That kind of thing, beyond the looking at selfless and supportive kind of life. That's being enhanced now. So it's happening. I'm very hopeful about what's happening in Africa, despite the gloom and doom that we hear outside, and despite all that, trying to caricature Africa's, that externally driven narrative is collapsing by itself because it's full of lies in a way. So, the truth is coming out. Africans are becoming more assertive, affirming their own systems and values, and the youth are at the forefront of this.
That, I believe, was a very fulfillment answer to our question and a beautiful summarization for this conversation. And I just hope the audiences were able to take benefit, not just like information, but like actionable insights that they can use, like to raise awareness firstly among themselves and then like within their communities, and especially the African youth listening to us today. And just, Professor, I would really like to thank you for taking the time to just lending us your voice and lending us your mind and opening up to us. So it has been a pleasure. It has been an honor. And thank you simply is not enough.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for our audience tuning in as well.